Good evening and welcome to the Westland Library. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation. It is my pleasure to welcome historian Andrew.L.Kercher back to Westland. Andrew has a degree in history and philosophy from Albion College and an MS in historic preservation from Eastern. He lives in Port Huron, but also spent about a decade around the Straits of Mackinac and now lectures around the state on a number of fascinating history topics. Tonight he'll be speaking about forgotten U.S. presidents, names we might be familiar with more as names of schools or neighborhood streets than of our former leaders. Some of these forgotten presidents actually navigated major crises or enacted significant policy, or maybe they just had a fascinating story. Regardless, they all had a role to play in the development of American politics. Again, thanks for coming, and help me to welcome Andrew.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm always excited to be here. I really enjoy getting to come out to these. I often joke at the beginning of many of my lectures that, I am a historian by training. Right now, I'm a bookmobilist by trade. I run the bookmobile up in St. Clair County. And you don't get into the library or the museum field like I've been in if you have a lust for money and power. Instead, this is something we do because I really enjoy it. And this is a topic that I always find interesting. I'm a political junkie. I really like modern politics, but I also like historical politics. And that's one note I always like to make before we even get into our first slide or anything like that. We're certainly going to be talking a lot about a lot of forgotten presidents. And one of the nice things about that is, by my own estimation, I really only have one president in the 20th century that I kind of consider a forgotten president. And we don't get anywhere near the 21st century. So we don't get to talk any modern politics at all. And one of my caveats is we're going to talk a lot about a number of these presidents who have come from different political parties. And in a sense, they're really sharing their name with modern political parties, but not much else. So if we're talking about like a Democrat in the 1840s, yeah, their planks, their policies, very little relation to the modern Democratic Party. Same thing with like a Republican in the 1870s, where you'd be pretty hard pressed for them to recognize too much of the modern political platform. These parties, we've gone through about 5 different phases of party systems where the parties have rebuilt themselves. So not a ton of connection, but I always like to just mention that kind of up front, that we're very divorced from modern politics when talking about some of these historical figures. And I've always been fascinated by them in another way, in that the president is one of the most famous people on earth. Any of the last, let's say, even 5 presidents, you would recognize in a heartbeat, right? Like, you know them all, you know what they sound like, you can hear their voice when they're on the radio, you know who's talking. So it's fascinating to me to think that you go more than 100 years, and sometimes you get some of these men who at one time were some of the most famous men on earth. You wouldn't be able to pick them out of a police lineup. The average person just doesn't recognize these people anymore. And I think that's really fascinating how you can go from that. And it does make me sometimes think of who of our modern day, famous politicians, famous political figures in another 100 years, you're only going to have a history nerd like me interested in them, right? So it talks all about history. But we'll kind of dive right in. And of course, we are talking about obscure presidents. So we won't be talking a whole lot about this guy, you know who, right? We're not even going to, we don't even have to say his name. But when we talk about presidents, we can even find, because depending on how you want to measure, if you want to be a real pedant, and I sure do, we can actually go back to an earlier system and ask ourselves, who was the first president? Because the system that we operate under now, the U.S. constitutional system, is arguably kind of a mulligan for our country. We got to start over in 1789 with a new constitutional system. So there's ways you can make an interesting argument. When a country declares independence, you only get that independence if other countries recognize it, right? You have to win that war of independence in a way. So you can make an argument for somebody like Peyton Randolph here, who was the president of the First and Second Continental Congress. Hopefully we're all on a real, America 250th kick. We've probably all been reading our, colonial history, or at least thinking a little bit about it, right? With the big birthday. But we remember before we even declared independence, there was a First and a Second Continental Congress. And this guy was elected president of that Congress. So in some ways, maybe Peyton Randolph should be the first president, right? Or how about John Hancock, all right? So John Hancock, that's maybe a little bit more familiar of a name. He was the president when the United States would actually draft up and sign that Declaration of Independence. Now, when they all sat around signing that, famously John Hancock with his big signature, they didn't know if it was going to work or not, right? You, again, have to win the war. You don't know if that counts. But when he signs off on that, he was also the president of the Continental Congress at that time. Now, when they declare independence, they don't have an official government yet, right? They form eventually the Articles of Confederation they draft, which was a terrible system of government. So bad, it only lasts for about 13 years before they're like, hey, scrap this, we got to start over. But under that system, there were people like Samuel Johnson here, was elected president, and he turned them down. And so like, nah, that's okay, I don't want to do that. So like, we've elected presidents who have said no. But you can even get to somebody like John Hanson here. John Hanson has a pretty decent claim at being the first president of the United States. And no one has heard of John Hanson, right? A real no-namer when it comes to this because he's president under the Articles of Confederation. So if you want to talk obscure, and I do, we can definitely count him up there. But once we get into our constitutional system that we're still operating under right now, from 1789, the first 10 or so presidents are all kind of bangers. They're all people that everybody knows right away. You've got your Washingtons, your Adams, your Jeffersons. It's not until, and it's my list, it was my criteria, so I get to pick who's obscure, right? It's not until we get to Martin Van Buren that I think that is our first truly obscure president. I try to find little quotes from all of these obscure presidents so they could kind of speak for themselves in some sense, so it's not just me, right? Easier to do a job right than explain why you didn't. Seems like good advice, right? So Martin Van Buren's born at Old Kinderhook in New York. There's some speculation as that might be the origin of okay that we still all kind of use today. It's right around the time that expression was coming into vogue. And he was from kind of a little bit upstate New York. He wasn't from quite New York City. But that does provide something really interesting. When he was at home, Martin Van Buren was the very first president and the only president we've had so far that English was not his first language. Anybody know what he spoke at home? Any guesses? It was Dutch. Yeah, you're exactly right. So he comes from Dutch stock. It was New Amsterdam before it was New York. So he spoke Dutch and learned English a little bit later on in life. His wife there, Hannah, died quite early. He was widowed at just 35 years old. So his wife died back in 1819, well before he was president. He did upgrade from Old Kinderhook was his kind of homestead to, he lived at this place called Lindenwold. One of the other really interesting things, at least for me, is that he's our first legal president, in a sense. When you think about the presidency, and Scouts Honor, no curveballs here or anything, what are some of the requirements to be U.S. president? There's not very many of them that are laid out in the Constitution. Anybody know one?
Over 35.
You gotta be 35 years old, native born. You have to be a natural born U.S. citizen, right? And like, what does that mean? The Constitution wasn't really clear about what that actually means exactly. We've kind of understood that to mean you have to be a U.S. citizen like at birth, like you weren't a naturalized citizen. You're either naturalized or you're a natural born citizen like that rather than naturalized. And they did have to put a carve out because guess what? The first president who actually met that requirement was Martin Van Buren. Because all those people, Thomas Jefferson may be a famous president, but guess what? He sure wasn't a natural born citizen of the United States because the United States didn't exist when he was born. In fact, it was all of the presidents up to Martin Van Buren were not born in the United States because they were here when the country was formed. So they get kind of a grandfather clause. If you're there, if you're a founding father, you get in under the wire there. But Martin Van Buren, first president born in the United States as a country. So if we look at his election map, and I really enjoy this election map a ton here, it looks very different than what we're used to seeing today. So this is 1836. So this is, Michigan is kind of not even really a state yet. We wouldn't get our statehood until January of 1837, but very proactively, we decided to submit electoral college votes in advance anyway. But we can see the map, it has a lot of different colors on it, right? So Martin Van Buren, nominally a Democrat, again, like we talked before, it's not really the same policies or anything like that, the Democrats today. Both parties have had conservative and liberal wings over the years. There was a large chunk of the 19th century where the Democrats were generally the more conservative of the two political parties. So lots going on here. But they were, there was a couple plans. Martin Van Buren was running on the coattails of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was a highly divisive political figure. People, you either loved him or you hated him. There weren't too many people in between. So all of the states where we don't see Martin Van Buren winning are states where there was a coalition of powers that would kind of congeal together to run someone who was just opposed to Andrew Jackson for a variety of different reasons. And elections were very different in the 1830s than today. If you think about it, how do we engage with political candidates today? Sure, there's the whistle-stop tours, things like that. Candidates weren't doing that throughout much of the 19th century. You certainly weren't watching them on Twitter or TV. Martin Van Buren didn't make any appearances on Fox News or anything like that. So sometimes you run like your favorite son. In 1824, since no one had achieved the required majority of electoral college votes, the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. And that became a viable strategy. That hasn't happened since 1824. So we've had 200 years of kind of more regularly contested elections. But the plan was just prevent someone from getting that majority, and then you can decide things in the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote, no matter how big your state is. It's a very convoluted system, but that was a viable path to the presidency. So that's why we see states like South Carolina there, running Willie Pearson Magnum, who was a senator from South Carolina, who, I don't know, people in Vermont might have never even heard of him. But if you can win your own state, deprive your opposing candidate of any of those sweet, sweet electoral college votes. That's why we have like Daniel Webster winning up in Massachusetts and nowhere else. So that's the plan. It doesn't work. Martin Van Buren is able to carry enough of the states to get that majority. He becomes president in 1836. Again, riding in on the coattails of Andrew Jackson, one of these very famous presidents, right? Everybody likes to see him, especially in your wallet, right? So one of the other reasons I contend that presidents become obscure is that the issues that these presidents would deal with have become either moot or so arcane and confusing that we don't think about them a lot today. So, today, everybody, there's a lot of hot button issues that people have, a political opinion on one way or another. And that's always been true, but those issues do change over the years. So I'll give you an example. If you were a political junkie in the 1830s, you'd know what building this was. This is, of course, the second bank of the United States. And you'd have a very strong opinion about whether we should have a second bank of the United States. And this was the idea that the federal government will issue money and it will be the same in all the states rather than have, the first bank of Westland and then the first bank of Livonia. And can you even trust that Livonia money? I don't know. It's a wildcat bank over there, right? So there was this series of small banks like that. And obviously we kind of determined that doesn't work very well. But that was a serious issue, very contentious. In the 1830s that they were talking about. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren very much against having a national bank of the United States and allowing these individual and smaller state banks to issue their own money. I'm always curious, I'll put this in the back of your mind and think about if you had the first bank of Westland again, who are you guys putting on your money? What I mean? What local people? Who's getting on the 20 in Westland? That's what I want to know, right? There are other issues, like the Amistad case. This is an interesting one. This was the international slave trade had been banned by 1808 with the Constitution. This did not mean slavery was illegal. It was illegal to import new enslaved people from Africa. And so this was a Spanish ship heading to a Spanish colony. The enslaved people emancipate themselves by killing the crew, and the ship drifts into a U.S. harbor. What do you do with them? Spain's like, excuse me, that's our property. And a lot of people say, well, no, it's not. Those people should be free to go. And this is an issue that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, a major issue of the day. Very few people have heard of this issue today. And again, really a moot point after the Civil War. Fortunately for them, the Supreme Court does rule that they don't have to go back to Spain. They are free people having landed here. So a rare win in the 19th century. This is an interesting, I always love reading quotes about some of these obscure presidents. So this is Joseph Smith. He's the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, commonly called, the Mormons, well known as kind of an American religion. Joseph Smith did not have very many nice things to say about Martin Van Buren. He says, "He was not as fit as my dog for the chair of state, for my dog will make an effort to protect his abused and insulted master, while the present chief magistrate will not so much as lift a finger to relieve an oppressed and persecuted community of freemen." So the Mormons get their start in upstate New York, they move down to Ohio, they eventually are settled out in Missouri. They run into a lot of problems in Missouri with the local population. Their religious beliefs are certainly off the beaten path. They're kind of fringe beliefs for a lot of like mainline Protestants that they're in these same communities with. And there's a lot of friction. And it eventually gets to the point where the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, issues an extermination order against Mormons. You were allowed to just shoot them on site with no repercussion. So you might imagine, like, the leader of this movement said, hey, I thought we had, like, freedom of religion in this country. I'm going to the president and complaining. And Martin Van Buren basically goes like, oh, I don't know, kind of like sits on his hands and doesn't really take a stance on this. It actually leads to Joseph Smith saying, all right, well, you know, if you can't get anyone to help you, you got to do the job yourself. And Joseph Smith would actually run for president. Things don't work out great for Smith in the long run. By 1844, he's assassinated in the Carthage jail when kind of an unruly mob shows up, kills him and his brother, knock him out a window, shoot him some more on the ground. The reason I mention all of this, it's an interesting tie to presidential history, is that he decided he would run for president. And so he's the very first presidential candidate ever assassinated in U.S. history while running for office. There is a long history of political violence in this country. And that's one that was extracted some violence against General Joseph Smith there from Nauvoo, where they had fled from Missouri. But one of the other big problems that Martin Van Buren would have while in office, and this goes for many presidents, if the economy collapses while you are president, whether or not it is your fault, you are not going to get reelected. So he's elected in 1836, and there's something called the Panic of 1837. We call them panics, or they called them panics then. Today we would call this a recession or a depression, depending on how severe it is. And so in his re-election bid, it's basically hopeless. He realizes just a couple of years in, the economy has gone down the drain. Whether it's his fault or not, kind of inconsequential. There's a lot of people out there who maybe sometimes think if like Facebook comments are to be believed, the president has a big lever that controls gas price and the economy go up, economy go down. It doesn't work like that. But if the economy crashes while you're in the hot seat, like, you're going to get blamed, you're not going to get reelected, right? So in the election of 1840, as Martin Van Buren is running for re-election against William Henry Harrison, Harrison puts himself up as the man of the people, his regular guy. And so here's Martin Van Buren drinking a beautiful goblet of White House champagne, a fancy guy. And when we pull the little tab down, his eyes roll up in his head, and it becomes an ugly mug of log cabin hard cider. So interesting that he would lose out to a guy who is actually far richer than him. But that goes to show you perception is reality. So William Henry Harrison runs with this log cabin type image that he's a simple guy. He runs with one of the most famous political slogans. There's probably one thing you know about William Henry Harrison, and that's his nickname was Old Tippecanoe. Tippecanoe and... So yeah, we remember his political campaign slogan of Old Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Probably not much else, and there truly isn't that much else to say. He was a general during the War of 1812. He's actually a general before that. He won that Battle of Tippecanoe back in the 1790s against indigenous folks around the Great Lakes. His wife Anna, he has quite a few kids, as you can see here on his list. So he keeps pretty busy. And this is his house. He becomes the governor of Indiana. Indiana Territory at first, it becomes a state by 1816. This is grouse land. It looks like a big southern plantation. He took a rather interesting stance in that he really wished that slavery was extended into places like Indiana and Illinois. He thought the big southern plantation style slavery would be great throughout the Midwest. Not a ton of people agreed with him, but he was still a war hero, so he still gets on that ticket, and he's the very first Whig to win the presidency in 1840. Now, the problem he has, one of the biggest things running against him in the campaign, when he runs in 1840, he is considered way too old to become president. He is 68. And everyone says that's right out, right? Oh, how much we've changed, right? So 68 used to be way too old, and he actually went on to prove how wrong he was. It's kind of interesting as we give this lecture just the other night. I'm sure many of you probably watched like the State of the Union. It set a record for the longest State of the Union, and it wasn't quite 2 hours. he gave a speech that was 3.5 hours long in a driving rain in 40 degrees as his inaugural address to prove just, how fit he was. And then appropriately, he immediately catches pneumonia and dies 30 days later. He is not president for even a full month. So not much to say about the presidency of William Henry Harrison. Right? 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes before he almost immediately dies. But that means now we get Tippy Canoe, so we get, and Tyler too. Tyler has become the president. So John Tyler, if the tide of defamation and abuse shall turn, my administration come to be praised, future vice presidents who may succeed to the presidency may feel some slight encouragement to pursue an independent course. This is the first time a vice president has become president. Like, we're testing out the system, right, that we've put in place. How's it actually work? One of the things that John Tyler would have to do a lot of is return letters that would be written to acting President Tyler. And he said, no, none of this acting president. I really am the president. That's how this is going to work. There were a lot of people who said that he should try and do everything that he thought that his predecessor was going to do. And like, oh, you're just kind of like a caretaker until the next election. He said, no, I really am the president. He changed up some members of the cabinet that he didn't like. There's maybe a common misconception, or at least sometimes we tend to think of like, oh yeah, the president and vice president, they're a team, they must like each other. That is frequently not the case. They're frequently like political rivals within their own party. They're from different parts of the country. More often than not, they don't like each other very much. They find it politically expedient to get along and smile for the cameras. But as we found a couple times in history, there have been some cracks in that veneer where they do not like each other. John Tyler had more children than any other president, so he stays very, very busy indeed. There's his large plantation in Virginia. He has 2 wives, not at the same time. The first one dies, he gets married again. She's about 35 years younger than him, so he is having children in his late 70s. So one of the interesting side effects of that is one of his youngest children would go on to have children of his own in his 80s. And so we have people like Lyon Tyler Jr., who just died in 2020, and Harrison Tyler, who just died a couple of months ago in 2025. These are grandchildren of our 10th president, who were alive until like months ago, right? And so you have the family tree of like John Tyler, who's born in 1790, had a grandchild living until last year, which is just kind of wild to think about how little American history there actually is. Just 3 generations we can get back all the way to the founding of the country, right? So here's Tyler receiving the news of Harrison's death. I love this picture just because of apparently how little there is to do as vice president, that he's sitting in a very uncomfortable chair just staring out at his plantation, right? They don't have TV back then, so. And look how excited he is getting this letter. A lot of action in this shot here. But he did become the president, and he would set a lot of precedents. One of the other kind of interesting things, there are some, every once in a while you come across one of these news stories that would have been, if they happened today, I cannot conceive of what a big news story it would be today if this happened. So by the 1840s, the U.S. Navy was going under this major rebuild as they were adding steamships into the Navy. And they were steam-powered. They also had the sails, brand new ships. And so they like to take these out for a cruise. And this is what was happening one February in 1844. And they had bought 2 of these new guns. These are huge cannons on board, and they were firing them off for like big salutes for all the bigwigs on board. And the Stockton gun, this one was actually called the Peacemaker. Well, lo and behold, they go to fire it one last time, and there was a fault in the casting of the gun. The gun's breech would explode, and this was very dangerous. I love this woodcut, mostly because of this guy. Looks like he's doing a fun little dance move there. I'm like, no. But the huge explosion, and this explosion would kill the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy. It would kill the captain of the ship they were on. It would kill the president's father-in-law, another high-priced lawyer. It killed Armistead, the president's personal valet, so an enslaved man who was like the president's bagman, who was always right there at his side. Tyler was just a couple of steps away from being in the line of being killed by this cannon. And like, can you imagine the news if like members of the cabinet are killed in a military exercise and the president is like steps away? This would be all we'd be talking about for months. And this is an incident that I am willing to bet anyone like a nice steak dinner, you've never heard of this before, right? This is such an obscure part of American history. we almost then wound up in a bit of almost like a constitutional crisis, right? Because there was no provision to replace the vice president. So remember, he's already been the vice president, becomes the president. What if he dies? Who becomes the president then? And so we almost wound up with good old Willie Pearson Magnum from South Carolina, which President Magnum goes hard. That's a cool sounding presidential name. But he was the Speaker pro tem of the Senate, and just a heartbeat and a couple steps away from becoming president in the 1840s. Some of the activities, Tyler signs the very first treaty with China in the 1840s. They signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which gives us our modern-day border with Maine. They figured out in the woods where that should be a border, and they admit Texas into the country. So those are some of the political issues of his candidacy. And he is, interestingly, the only president not to be buried under the American flag, because he would go on to survive until the 1860s, and being from Virginia, he became a traitor to the United States and joined the Confederacy. So after betraying the country he was president of, he winds up dropping dead in 1862 while he is a member of Confederate Congress and gets an entire Confederate high honor funeral. So he gets, instead of underneath the Stars and Stripes, he's under the Stars and Bars. So there's a fun little piece of presidential trivia. Only one president not buried underneath the American flag, and it's John Tyler. So after Tyler, we get Polk. Polk's a one-term guy. He gets everything he wants done. Again, this is kind of an arbitrary listing on my part of who I consider obscure or not. There is a They Might Be Giants song about him. So I said, not obscure, right? Go listen to that song. It's a great song. It's a real banger. He accomplishes everything he wants while in office, including war with Mexico. And it's during the Mexican War that we will kind of get the inklings of our next president, Old Rough and Ready, the hero of Palo Alto. And this is Zachary Taylor. And if you want to talk about the presidents who are the most confused, John Tyler and Zachary Taylor. They're very close to each other in presidential order. Their names are astoundingly similar, and they're both incredibly forgettable. So lots of people, I have myself mixed up Taylor and Tyler. But remember, Taylor, American hero, Tyler, eventual traitor. So I don't know a good rhyme or something to memorize that. But when Zach Taylor was becoming president, what was interesting, he ran as a Whig, but both political parties approached him and said, like, hey, do you want to run for president with our political party? We see you're this big war hero. We don't even really know your politics. What are your key issues? And he's like, oh, I don't vote. I don't do that. So he's a president who had never even voted before he became president. So that's kind of interesting. He was a highly religious man, though. So if we want to be very pedantic, and once again, I do, we know that there's one more president in between, because March 4th, the old inauguration day, in 1849 fell on a Sunday. And Zachary Taylor said, I am a highly religious man. I am not taking an oath of office on a Sunday. That is a day of rest. I'll do it tomorrow. Well, the Constitution doesn't really let you do that. They said the old president's term ends at noon, and the new guy's supposed to start. And if he doesn't take that oath, it will then devolve down the chain to the next guy who's sworn in. They swear in Congress before they swear in the president. So without a president or vice president having taken an oath of office, we get our perhaps most obscure real president, David Rice Atchison, who was president for a single day in 1849. So it's even on his tombstone there. He was the president pro tem of the Senate. He slept most of the day away and spent the entire afternoon playing marbles with his kids. And upon being told, like, hey, did you know, like, you're technically the president? He's like, I wish someone would have told me that earlier. I would have done something maybe more interesting than sleep in and play marbles. But David Rice Atchison, president for one day in 1849. I bet you they're not putting him on money anytime soon. But then we get old Zach Taylor here. Never judge a stranger by his clothes. Maybe good advice. One of the other reasons that Taylor is so forgettable is that he would also die very quickly in office. He's from Kentucky. There's his home, Louisville, his wife, Peggy Smith Taylor. And he would not last long at all. So he is inaugurated in March, and basically by July, he has dropped dead. So he's another one of these presidents who lasts less than even half a year. While he was in office, he went out on the 4th of July. He was watching them start work on the Washington Monument. was at least started under his tenure. It would take decades and decades and decades. It was kind of a stalled project. It's its own whole story. But he went out to watch the start. He ate a great big bowl of cherries, had a nice cold glass of milk, came home and said, my stomach feels funny, and then took a nap and didn't wake up. He died. So like that was the end of Zach Taylor, right? There's his mausoleum right there. There's a lot of speculation. Some of it went so far as that he was poisoned. I don't think anyone wanted to poison Zach Taylor. Like, who would have it out against him, right? But one of the big speculations is that it was probably not so much the milk and the cherries as it could have been something he picked up from the water at the White House. The White House was drawing its water from a well in the 1840s and 50s. This was in the middle of a swamp. And they did not have a sanitary sewer system. And as gross as that is to think about, like there was sewers seeping into their fresh drinking water supply. And as a result, there were a number of presidents who would get pretty sick from this before they would eventually fix that whole system as Washington, D.C. Would grow. You know, today, we're used to Washington, D.C. is, I mean, more people live there than like the whole state of Wyoming. It's a major city. It's like the size of Detroit. But back in the 1850s, it's a swamp. That's kind of the middle of nowhere, right? So easy to see how you could get some of that bad water. But now, once again, we got another vice president who has been called up to the big leagues. He's president, Millard Fillmore, very famous for being obscure because he has kind of a funny name. May God save the country, for it's evident its people will not. So by the 1850s, we also see the coming fractures in the United States with the Civil War on the horizon. I do like this quote here. If God knows I detest slavery, but it's an existing evil for which we're not responsible. We must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution until we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope, the free government in the world. Basically, what he's saying when he would sign some of these like pro-slavery acts is, well, what do you want me to do about it? I'm only the president of the United States. What can the humble leader of the country do? There's a lot of these presidents, and that's another recurring theme and through line, is that many of these presidents who would basically relinquish quite a bit of their power, say like, oh, well, I don't want to overstep my bounds. That's how you kind of become forgettable, is to not take action on some of these issues. So he's from New York. I like his little house here. His wife Abigail died partway through his term in 1853. He did become really good friends with Dorothea Dix, and he was far more successful as a university president at the State University of New York in Buffalo than he was as a U.S. president, which is pretty wild to think about. And a little obelisk here at his gravesite. Slavery became kind of the defining issue of most of the 1850s as the country was locked on course with a civil war at that point. Basically, everyone's stepping on the accelerator. They're getting there faster and faster. So a number of these issues really spring up. Fillmore was the first president. He signed the Gadsden Purchase, so he bought the last little chunk of New Mexico and Arizona, meaning this was finally sea to shining sea, right? All of the continental 48 states were under his purview. So the first president to have what we would recognize as, at least geographically, most of the United States today. He's also the president who is famous for sending Matthew Perry to Japan. Of course, not this Matthew Perry, but this one, right? So Admiral Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy. And Perry would go to Japan, and Fillmore advises a really interesting trade negotiation. You want to talk about a president who is really savvy with the art of the deal. What you do is you send your Navy over, you take a great big warship, and even if the country has been closed for business for 300 years, it's like showing up at somebody's house. And they're not having a garage sale, but then you point a cannon at their house and say, guess what? You are having a garage sale now, or we will shoot your house with this cannon. That was our trade negotiation with Japan, is show up, park your warship in the capital and say, you're going to start trading with us or we will shoot you. And guess what? They started trading with us. We opened Japan after several hundred years of being closed for business. And the best part about all of this is that Japan becomes incredibly hungry for U.S. history. You know, they have had no contact with the rest of the world. Being history nerds and being people who come to a presidential lecture, like, you're probably going to want to see this, because one of my favorite things is the Japanese write a textbook about like the U.S. presidents and the American Revolution, and it's just great. So, you know, they have this very peculiar art style that, you know, has become like manga and anime today. And you look at some of this, like this is from this booklet. This is George Washington and the Spirit of Liberty during the American Revolution. So instead of musket, he's got his bow of arrow here. This is George Washington defending his wife, Carol from a British official. You know, his wife's name is actually Martha Washington, but something got lost in translation there. Like, okay, close enough. Here's John Adams and an eagle killing an enormous snake that ate John Adams' mother. Oh, okay, that's an interesting anecdote you don't see in a lot of U.S. history textbooks, but in Japan, it's more exciting. One more. Benjamin Franklin firing a cannon that he holds with his bare hands, with John Adams, like, pointing where to fire. Like, this is the coolest version of Ben Franklin. That is what should be on the $100 bill, is him holding a cannon under his hands like that. So wild, and really, you want to talk about obscure presidents? These guys are pretty obscure, this version of them anyway, right? Well, when Fillmore finishes, he's a vice president, he decides to run again, but he actually will lose to Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce is a Democrat, but he is a Northern Democrat. So he is from New Hampshire. And there was a real thought that maybe a Northern Democrat would be able to heal some of this growing divide. You summon me in my strength, or my weakness, you must sustain me by your strength. Nothing left to do but get drunk. Frequently, the more trifling the subject, the more animated and protracted the discussion. So Franklin Pierce comes from a long line of politicians in New Hampshire. He had a very sad life. He might be one of my votes for the saddest president. Franklin Pierce had 5 kids, 4 of whom had died by the time he was elected president. Robert Pierce here caught a fever and died while he was running for office, and his wife had actually begged him not to run for the presidency. Said, stay here in New Hampshire. I just got, like, the vibes are rancid, man. I don't want you running for office. And he does anyway, and he wins. And so he leaves his house here in New Hampshire. He and little Benjamin here, his last kid, who is about 9 years old, with his wife Jane, take off for Washington, D.C. And on the way, they are taking a train, relatively new technology. There are iron rails. One of the iron rails had actually bent up, and it caught the bottom of the car that they were in. It goes through the bottom of the car, and it rips little Benjamin Pierce's head clean off in front of his parents. His child is decapitated. It's his last child. This breaks him and his wife. You know, Jane would never recover. She suffered extreme depression the rest of her life. And Franklin wasn't much better off. Franklin would have probably resigned the presidency. I have some speculation that he may have just said, like, I just want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. Like, my wife really hates me now, and, like, all of my kids are dead. What's the point of this? And he self-medicated with alcohol and just was drank away most of his presidency. But one of the reasons he probably did not resign is his vice president. This guy right here, William Rufus Devane King. King was from Alabama. Again, you take your president, vice president in different parts of the country, right? So King was a very sick man during the campaign. He had caught basically like consumption, tuberculosis, coughing up blood. He's just very, very sick. And at one point, a doctor advises him to go to a clinic in Jamaica to try and get to like warmer weather and see if that'll like clear things up. And he's actually the only vice president who's ever taken the oath of office on foreign soil. They have like the U.S. ambassador have to come over to swear him in. Well, he's elected, he's sworn in, he's like, all right, I'll start making my way back to Washington to be president, but I got to swing back by home. So he lands in Alabama, he gets to his plantation, and he dies like 12 hours later. He is vice president for 6 days. Like, just immediately, like, dies very, very quickly. So now, there's no vice president. So if Franklin Pierce resigns, it becomes the president pro tem of the Senate, and it's the other party, so he can't do it. Like, whole thing falls apart, right? So we get Franklin Pierce being sworn in. It's not necessarily like the happiest of these inaugurations, right? This country is really starting to fall apart. The fractions are very, very clear. You've got like senators like beating each other on the floor of the Senate. They're all bringing in sticks and guns. They're arguing, again, over slavery. It's highly, highly contentious. There are ideas like, oh, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, Kansas and Nebraska are about to become states. Should they be free states? Should they be slave states? Let's let them vote on it. That seems fair. That only leads to a huge amount of violence. You get groups like Quantrill's Raiders riding in from Missouri who are just shooting up places like Lawrence, Kansas, which is home to a lot of free soilers. And you got people like my man John Brown here, who his solution is to go to a slaver's house, invite them out on the front lawn, and cut their heads off with a broadsword. So you have like violence openly in U.S. states. It really is the beginning of the Civil War, just a couple of years before the Civil War we know. So when Franklin Pierce's term is over, he's done. He's out. He's like, I wanted to go home from like the minute I set foot here. So now we wind up with James Buchanan, who is frequently regarded as the worst president of the United States. And the last president of the United States. If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you're a happy man indeed. So James Buchanan from Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, pretty big house. He was a pretty successful lawyer, did pretty well for himself. One of the interesting things here with his family life is when William Rufus Devane King would die, this is what James Buchanan would have to say. I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but not succeeded with any one of them. I feel it is not good for a man to be alone, and I should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners when I am well, and not expect from me any ardent or romantic affection. James Buchanan was living with this guy. Both of them, neither one was married. You don't have to do a whole lot of like reading between the lines to kind of see like what was going on here. Like James Buchanan was almost certainly gay. It's not something that terms they would have used in the 1850s, but like these two guys had nicknames in Congress. It was Aunt Fancy and Miss Nancy, and everyone's like, oh yeah, like those two guys who aren't married and live with each other, they're over there. We kind of all know. And you can read about it. And like when Devane King dies, like they immediately burn all his letters. So like we don't have access to that. And I think Buchanan also burned a lot of his correspondence as well as personal letters like back and forth. So we just don't have access to that. But like I said, I don't think it takes too much of a leap to get to where we are. So our only confirmed bachelor president that we've ever had in James Buchanan. That's him there with the wildly large and flamboyant bow tie in the cabinet meeting of James K. Polk. There's a huge panic when Buchanan becomes president. What did we say before? If the economy collapses while you're president, you're not getting reelected. So he's going to be a one-termer for sure, and he knows that. And we basically have, by the end of his term, when Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, that's when we have southern states actively seceding from the Union. And Buchanan does nothing. He basically says like, oh, no, stop, I guess, but doesn't send soldiers anywhere, doesn't try and secure any parts of that. The Civil War could have been shortened by years by a tiny amount of action on his part as these southern states were attempting to leave the country. So again, widely considered one of the worst presidents of all time. But you follow him up with the big guy, you know, Abe Lincoln, the great emancipator. You got Johnson, Grant. None of those guys are particularly obscure, but we do get to one more like batch of these obscure presidents. And this is the batch that are like the obscure bearded men of the late 19th century. There's a kind of batch of them that are easily forgotten. Rutherford Hayes is a good example of one. My policy is trust peace and put aside the bayonet. I do not think it's wise policy to decide contested elections by use of the National Army. So this is Hayes here. Hayes and his wife, they were, his wife Lucy was sometimes called Lemonade Lucy because they were teetotalers. Certainly a far cry from Ulysses S. Grant. I imagine when they moved into the White House, they probably found some like bottles in the couch cushions, right? But their house down here in Fremont is called Spiegel Grove. It is actually the closest presidential site to us right here. If you ever get a chance and get jonesing for some presidential history, do not sleep on this one. It's an amazing presidential site, even if he's relatively obscure. They do a great job, great museum, great historic home. Go check that out. My favorite thing upon going there that I learned was Rutherford B. Hayes was a technophile. He loved new technology. He had a phone installed very early on. And here's my favorite piece of perhaps any kind of trivia of all time. Rutherford B. Hayes' phone number was 35. That's it. So like that's how early of an adopter he was, that he has phone number 35. Here's a picture of him. What a handsome guy, right? Before he grows this beard that kind of makes him anonymous. I could see somebody like this running for office today, like very like piercing eyes and just like kind of has that look of a politician about him. So his election in 1876, a highly contentious election. 1876 was not a great year for the United States for a couple of reasons, but this election, the southern states had just been readmitted to the Union. They're submitting like different sets of electoral returns. I know recently, like in the news, there's lots of talk about like, oh, we need to go back to paper ballots and that's much more secure. Believe me, they didn't have a touch-a-computer in 1876. They're all paper ballots, and it was a very confusing election. Multiple states sent in, like Louisiana said like, 2 sets of returns in, and Congress still had to ultimately decide which one are we going to accept. And they would eventually come up with a compromise. So Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, and they would end radical Reconstruction. So Northern soldiers would leave the South, and it would actually enter in the era of Jim Crow. So black people basically lost that right to vote that they had gained after the Civil War. As soon as the Union Army's out the door, they change all of the voting laws to make sure that like those black men who had been voting and running for office are disenfranchised until the 1960s. 1876, it's our centennial year, so people are excited about 100 years of the United States, but there's kind of a pall that's put over all of that when right as they open this convention, they get news of a U.S. Army defeat, perhaps one of the most famous U.S. Army defeats of all time, the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which we call the Little Bighorn today, right? So everyone's like, oh, not great, right? But one of the other really interesting things going on in 1876, Hayes becomes one of the few presidents who is better known in another country than in the United States. This is Francisco Solano Lopez. He is the president of Paraguay. And when I say president, he is definitely like El Presidente. He is El Jefe for sure. He might be better called like Generalissimo. He wins elections down there with like Saddam Hussein level, like 99% of the vote, right? And he considers himself a military genius. Well, this military genius winds up getting into a war called the War of the Triple Alliance because Paraguay decides to declare war on Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil at the same time. And again, you don't have to be like a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to realize like declaring war on every country that touches you at the same time is probably not good. It does not go well. It looks a lot like the Civil War. It's happening in the 1870s, but even more violent, even more bloody. It gets to the point where about 80% of the male population of Paraguay is killed. Like, this is unbelievably devastating to the country. And by all rights, those other countries were about to like dismember Paraguay, just cut it up and it would cease to exist. But Paraguay, after Lopez's, they catch him in like a spider hole out in the jungle and like drag him in. And he goes out like fighting in a blaze of glory. And so Paraguay finally gets a chance to send for help. And instead of sending for help, they're like, we know we're not going to win, but could the president of the United States come down and mediate an end to this war? And he does, and amazingly, as we know, Paraguay still exists. And this red province right here is Provincia de Hayes. They named an entire state after President Hayes for saving the country. So like I said, probably better known in Paraguay than he is in the United States. So after Hayes has spent his term. He's actually one of these few presidents who's not re-nominated by his own party in 1880. He would lose out to James Garfield. And Garfield and Chester Arthur are kind of a pair. Chester Arthur here, madam, I may be president of the United States, but my private life is no one's damn business. So James Garfield is assassinated in 1880. So very early on in his office, 1881. So he is elected in 1880, he's inaugurated March 4th of 1881. He is shot in June, but he actually wouldn't die until September. So Charles Guiteau, a lunatic office seeker who wanted to be named ambassador to France or ambassador to Italy, shot him in the back. And the really sad part is he almost certainly would have survived, except he got medical treatment. But he got medical treatment right in kind of the last couple of minutes before all of the doctors got on board with germ theory. So the first doctor who gets to him is a guy by the name of Dr. Willard Bliss. Like, his first name was also Doctor. His parents named their kid Doctor, and then he became a doctor. So Dr. Bliss is just like sticking his unwashed finger in Garfield's back looking for the bullet. They can't find it. It gets infected, and months later he dies in agony. It's its own. That would make a really good lecture all on itself. There's a lot to that story. They eventually hang Guiteau. So they do reform civil service after that, so they have less of these office seekers. It's one of the few things Chester Arthur is able to do. Arthur is our best dressed president. He loved fashion. He was controller for the Port of New York, so he was pretty wealthy from that. He had 70 pairs of pants. Think about the logistics of that. That is a lot of pairs of pants to own. So he was also the first president to have a swimming pool at his house. So pretty modern kind of guy. Sadly, a lot of Arthur's reputation would be marred by his signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in 1881, when he signs this Exclusion Act, this is basically the very first time we have any limitations on immigration into the United States. And it is explicitly a very racist act saying, like, nope, we just don't want any Chinese. You're not allowed in. If you're Chinese, we're not interested in having you. So really kind of ruins a bit of Arthur's legacy for sure. But now we come to Grover Cleveland. I'll be upfront about my biases. Grover Cleveland might be one of my least favorite presidents. I just don't like the guy very much. He mocks the people who proposes a government shall protect the rich and that they, in turn, will care for the laboring poor. I feel obliged to withhold my approval of the plan, as proposed by this bill, to indulge a benevolent and charitable sentiment through appropriation of public funds for that purpose. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution. So what Cleveland was talking about, there's some people, there had been a massive flood. A bunch of people went to the president and searched for it. They said, like, hey, does the federal government have any like emergency relief money? All these people lost their houses. Should the government do something? And his response was like, well, I don't see anything in the Constitution about helping people. I'm not going to do that. And they just don't. That's how small the government was in the 1880s and the 1890s. So Grover Cleveland was born at the Caldwell Presbyterian Parsonage up here in New Jersey. So son of a preacher, and he was actually the only president to get married while he was in office. And again, maybe it's editorializing. I think it's pretty gross because he marries Frances Folsom Cleveland. Frances Folsom was his 21-year-old goddaughter. That his business partner, who had died like 20 years before, had made him his godfather. So he was kind of taking care of her, helping to raise her a little bit, and then he gets married when he is 57 and she is 21 in the White House. So she is far and away the youngest of all of the first ladies. He had served a number of different jobs for a while. He was actually running a prison system in Buffalo, New York, and he actually serves as a hangman for a little bit. He was actually the sheriff. They told him, they gave him a stipend and said, hey, here's $100. You can go hire like an executioner for this upcoming execution. And he said, well, hey, if I do it myself, do I get to keep the money? And they're like, well, I guess. And so he just decided to perform the executions himself. He was known to have a number of affairs during office, and in fact, a couple of these affairs had even broken through to like the mainstream when he was running. This is a pretty famous political cartoon of like, I want my paw, and Grover Cleveland looking very sad there. The poem was like, Ma, Ma, where's my paw? And after he won, the Democrats would say, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. Like, it just didn't matter. People just didn't care as much, even though this seemed to be pretty out there. And it kind of gets worse because it wasn't really just like an affair. This is Maria Helpin. She actually claimed that Grover Cleveland had raped her at a campaign rally, had met up with her at a hotel. She is pregnant when she approaches the president and his campaign saying like, hey, I'm pregnant, what are we going to do about this? Grover Cleveland had a couple of campaign goons pick her up, douse her in alcohol, and drop her off at a lunatic asylum where she was involuntarily committed. And so she has the kid in the lunatic asylum in New York. And so the kid would actually grow up. He'd be adopted eventually by one of the doctors there at the asylum. He'd go on to be rather famous gynecologist in upstate New York. So again, Grover Cleveland's like personal morals, I think, are subject to quite a bit of questioning to this day. His politics, this is the perfect example of one of these presidents that like, no one cares about this anymore, so we don't have strong opinions. Like one of the biggest issues he runs on is free minting of silver and how much silver should be worth how much gold when it all backs our U.S. currency. Well, we don't have either today, so not a lot of people care the ratio of gold to silver for U.S. money. I first created this slideshow a number of years ago, and a number of years ago, no one really knew what a tariff was, right? They've kind of come back with a vengeance. We all now maybe have opinions on tariffs again, but that was another major issue in the 1880s and 90s. It was like, how much of a tariff should we have? Should we have a tariff? How high should it be? And different parts of the country would argue about this. I love this little political map because I've never seen one that made the country look like a little pooch before, right? But they're arguing again about like gold and silver, kind of non-issues. So by the end of Cleveland's first term, we have Benjamin Harrison, who is the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Remember the old Tippy canoe who dies in 30 days. I pity the man who wants a coat so cheap. The man or woman who produces the cloth will starve in the process. So Harrison was a Civil War general, of course, for the Union. He's from Indianapolis. You can go see his house. It's a great presidential site as well. His first wife would actually die just at the very end of his his term in office, and his second wife would actually be his cousin. His family didn't like that very much. Here's a picture of his home gym. I just really enjoy that we have a picture of a presidential home gym. It's like old-timey juggling equipment, and it didn't work very well, as you can see. You actually look at all these pictures, his coat's like very tight, and like, oh, you're not really using that home gym a whole lot, are you there, Mr. Harrison? There's the bed that he died in, is in his house. A great museum, another one I really recommend. They completely revamped the U.S. Navy again while he was in office. He was the first president to live at the White House when they had electricity. He was very scared of the electricity. He'd heard a lot of rumors that you could get shocked from like a light switch, and so he refused to touch them himself. So there were a lot of times he'd be like in bed at night and the lights are on, and he'd just like wait till a servant walked by and be like, hey, will you shut the lights off? Like, I don't want to touch that. So somebody else can risk it. One of the reasons he probably wasn't reelected, he was the first president to sign a $1 billion budget. So obviously inflation has done away with that. He added more states than any other president, including North and South Dakota. And the Dakotas he signed, he shuffled them up on the desk and put another paper on top. So we don't know if North Dakota or South Dakota became a state first. If you've ever met a pair of like twins, they will tell you which one is older by like 30 seconds, right? So we don't know with the Dakotas which one came first. So here's another great example of like why these presidents get forgotten. Let's talk about the Homestead strike. So this was a major strike in Pennsylvania at some of the steel mills. They are complaining about unsafe practices. It's very unfair. Wages have been cut. They're being paid in like script they have to spend at the company store. All good reasons to strike, right? Solidarity forever for the union. The president finds out what to do. He sends in the army, they shoot at the strikers and give the factories back to the owners. So that is what a Republican president will do in the 1890s. They do sign the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it's kind of they don't do a lot of enforcing of that, right? So, oops, hey, guess who's back? It's Grover Cleveland. It's that sandwich president. He has a second non-consecutive term. So I do like the second time he runs with Adlai Stevenson, and his campaign is all about Cleve and Steve. And this is a bottle of Cleve and Steve whiskey for their campaign in '92. So the election, kind of interesting. Again, just look at one of these, see kind of where the country's breaking down. There's a bunch of western states that are going for a third Grange party, which is like a farmer party. We don't see that a whole lot anymore. But Cleveland is able to knock it out, again, on these issues of like silver and tariffs. But, oh, what's that? He's been president for a year, and there's another major strike. It's the Pullman strike, this time outside of Chicago. The workers are complaining that it's unfair and unsafe conditions, that they have to spend script in the company's store, their wages have been cut, and they're going on strike. So what does a Democratic president do? Well, he calls in the army, they shoot at the strikers and give the factory back to the owners. So not a lot of daylight between the two parties on like some of these kind of like labor policies at this time. So you can really see why they're both kind of like forgettable, right? Grover Cleveland also had a secret jaw surgery. He found out by his second term that he had jaw cancer rather severely growing. By this time, they know about germs, so he's got a better doctor than Garfield had. But he doesn't want anyone to know he's undergoing this rather risky procedure. So he actually took 6 weeks off and went out on a boat off the coast of the United States in the Atlantic Ocean and had his jaw removed in secret and replaced with a prosthetic. And no one knew for many years afterwards that the president was indeed a very sick man for a number of months there. And it was really like hit or miss, but he was able to pull that off in secret. I kind of doubt a president could even do that today. So now we have, McKinley, Roosevelt, both very famous. So we come to our last obscure president, and that is my man, William Howard Taft, one of my favorite presidents. I certainly like possum. I ate hardly of it last night. It did not disturb in my slightest my digestion or my sleep. Presidents come and go, but the Supreme Court goes on forever. So Taft, kind of famous as our largest president, right? So he's from Cincinnati. There's his house down there. Very actively involved in politics with his whole family. In fact, his wife was really the driving force, Nellie, to get him to even run for office. And his son, Robert Taft, would be known as Mr. Republican in like the 1940s and 50s, so actively involved at that time. He was really a devotee of Teddy Roosevelt. He came in on Teddy Roosevelt's coattails. Teddy Roosevelt handpicked him to run in 1908, and he won kind of in a landslide against William Jennings Bryan on his third time to run for office. So it didn't work out for Bryan. And Taft is easily broken in. Taft got to know Roosevelt all the way back in like 1901. Taft was the Governor General of the Philippines, which we had taken during the Spanish-American War. So there he is, arriving in the Philippines. He said when he got there, he sent a telegram back to President Roosevelt. And he said that, hey, I got to Manila. I went around the entire city by horseback, checked out all the sites, saw where the consulate was, and got my lodgings moved in. So I'm doing great. And President Roosevelt he telegraphed back and said, how's the horse? Which kind of mean, but pretty funny. My favorite joke about Taft that went around was that Taft was the nicest man in Washington, D.C. He once gave up his seat for 3 women. I bet you've never seen another president on a water buffalo before, right? So Taft did spend some time in the Philippines, but he'd come back. His wife would again encourage him to like run for office, run for the presidency, which he did. He was a member of Roosevelt's cabinet, and a lot of people don't know much about him. Like if you were hard pressed, most people would be like, oh, he got stuck in the bathtub. He did not, because he had a giant bathtub that 4 people could fit in installed. So it's like a jacuzzi in the White House. He's the first president to have an automobile. He had a great big white steam car from Ohio as the first presidential automobile. He's actually the first president to play golf, something we really associate with all the presidents today. Last president to have a cow at the White House for fresh milk, and the cow's name was Pauline Wayne, which I just think is really funny. It just kind of has a normal name. Pauline Wayne, the last White House cow. One of these famous things, Teddy Roosevelt famously refused to shoot a bear tied to a tree, and they make the stuffed cute bears, and it's a teddy bear. Today, teddy bears have no political connection at all. No one's thinking about Theodore Roosevelt when they get a teddy bear. But in 1908, people thought oh, each president is going to have their own stuffed animal. And so after Roosevelt left, they're like, we need something new, so I give you the Billy Possum to replace the teddy bear. Taft had attended a meeting down in Georgia where they kind of, tongue-in-cheek, gave him, oh, here's our local delicacy. It's a barbecue possum. And they set it in front of Taft. Taft ate the barbecue possum. He ate the whole thing. And he ate it so fast that a doctor nearby was like, I am medically concerned by how fast and how much barbecue possum you're consuming. Mr. President, you have to slow down. And this made news throughout the country because it's kind of a funny story. And so people associated possums with President Taft. So we have all of these stuffed oh, Billy Possum, and lots of postcards of that. This did not catch on. The teddy bear has stuck around. You don't get to buy a lot of Billy Possums, right? He did go on to serve on the Supreme Court, so he's the only president to ever inaugurate another president, give the oath of office to Herbert Hoover in 1928. I always like to wrap up with just a tiny bit more about, if you want to talk about obscurity, you got to talk about the vice presidents. They are hyper obscure, right? People can't even name all the vice presidents from their own lifetime, let alone before then, right? This is Thomas Marshall. Once there were 2 brothers. One ran away to sea. The other elected vice president. Nothing ever heard from either one of them again. Very true. So when the system was originally set up, it was the runner-up in the election became the vice president. Do you see any problems with that? Right? You've got people like this, Adams and Jefferson hated each other. And there's all sorts of fun duos you can think of that would have had to try and serve the country at the same time. So they fixed that pretty early on with the 12th Amendment, but they still had issues. So this is Thomas Marshall was the vice president for Woodrow Wilson. And when Woodrow Wilson had a very debilitating stroke in 1919, right at the end of World War I, kind of is like a loophole, because we know the vice president becomes president when the president dies. What happens when they're incapacitated? And a lot of people were pushing, they said hey, this is too important to not have a president, or have a president who's vegetative state. Marshall, do something. And he's like, no, not really, I don't want to. And so he just doesn't do anything. There's a reason nobody's ever going to remember him. But to bring everything full circle, I just want to tell you briefly about my absolute favorite vice president. I should mention, they also fix up all of the presidential succession rules with the 25th Amendment. So after Kennedy is killed, they were like, hey, we really got to get this. And that's why we have the designated survivor, the Secretary of Agriculture or something, who sits out the State of the Union, because we have that line all the way down of who can become president. But Richard Mentor Johnson, my favorite vice president of all time. Remember, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He ran against, they had their own poem, they had their own rhyme. Rumsey Dumpsey, Richard Johnson killed Tecumseh. So Richard Mentor Johnson was Martin Van Buren's vice president, and he had in fact killed Tecumseh. During the War of 1812, he was in a Kentucky cavalry unit, and he literally just like shot Tecumseh in the head with a pistol at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. And this is enough. That act alone will get you elected vice president, right? And you get the poem, you get to be like, I'm a veteran, you get to pound the war drum, all of that, that gets you in. But boy, what a weird guy. So there's so many odd things going on. He's from Kentucky. He is a slave owner. When his wife dies, he actually takes up with one of the enslaved women at his plantation. He does not free her, but he is now married and openly in a relationship with like one of his own slaves. Everyone hates this. In the North, there are people like, hey, like, slavery's bad, you shouldn't have that, we don't like that. There's a lot of people in the South who are like, hey, yeah, we know a lot of people are having relations with their slaves. You're like, see Thomas Jefferson. All of these slave owners are like raping their slaves, but they're doing it on like the DL. You don't do this out in public. Like Richard Mentor Johnson, who is now married to one of his slaves that he hasn't freed. He owns his wife and is having an open interracial relationship in the 1840s. This does not poll well, that is for sure. It gets wilder. He is very good friends with a guy named John Cleves Symmes Jr. This is an old war buddy of his from the War of 1812. Symmes runs an entire society dedicated to the idea that the earth is hollow. You could take this oath. I declare that the earth is hollow, habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within another, and it's open at the poles at 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth. I'm ready to explore the hollow if the world will support me in this undertaking. And so you've got like a kook, right? It was like the earth is hollow and there are 5 or 6 smaller Earths on the inside, and we should go explore it. And John Cleves Symmes is like, oh, and they'd be easier to conquer because the people who are living on those smaller Earths will be proportionately smaller than us. So we could go conquer them. Let's do it. And Richard Mentor, like, this is like normal, right? You're going to have lunatics at any time out in the street. What is weird is when they're best friends with the vice president, and the vice president's like, yeah, we should do that. And he keeps bringing it up in the Senate, saying, like, we need a Lewis and Clark style expedition to the center of the earth. And all the other senators keep asking him, like, yeah, bring that up again. It's really funny when you talk about it. And he doesn't realize they're just like laughing at him, right? They don't have TV back then, but you can get a guy raving about the hollow earth. When that panic of 1837 comes along and the economy collapses, they have an emergency board meeting, or not board, a cabinet meeting. They have an emergency cabinet meeting where all of the president's men show up, and they discover that Richard Mentor Johnson is straight up missing. Like, the vice president isn't at the cabinet meeting. Not only is he a little late, but somebody went to go get him, and like the stuff's gone from his house. We don't know where he is. And so they look around, and it's not until like 2 weeks later they discover that upon news that like the economy has collapsed, Richard Mentor Johnson has gone back home to Kentucky and opened a bar. And they discover him, quote, happy in the inglorious pursuit of tavern keeping, giving his personal superintendence to the chicken and egg purchasing and watermelon selling department. And they're like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh yeah, being vice president, that wasn't very fun. The economy was going bad, so I'm not doing that anymore. I'm running a bar now. And they're like, you are still the vice president. Like, come back. And he's like, I don't think so. So when Martin Van Buren runs for re-election in 1840, he says, no running mate, because Martin Van Buren hates this guy. And it's like, that guy is so nuts. It's been so damaging to me. I want nothing to do with him. But the amazing thing is, even with all that you've heard about Richard Mentor Johnson, he is carved into the U.S. Capitol in marble. There he is, shooting Tecumseh. You know, it, I think, says a lot about this country that, like, if you kill the right Indian, like, you will be immortalized in marble in this country forever. And it takes me to a larger point about the presidents, that no matter how obscure you are, you will still wind up in the Hall of Presidents at Disney World. So, again, my name is Andrew.Kercher. This is my email address, Andrew.L.Kercher@gmail.com. Kercher.info is my website with all of my upcoming talks. But I would love to take some questions from you folks today, any that you might have. And I know we have a microphone that'll be coming by, so if anyone has one, they'll be able to get that into the feed for the lovely people here in Westland. I don't know how to pander a little bit more. Did you guys have any thoughts? Who would you put on the 20 of Westland? Thoughts? Well, solid. I will also stick around if there aren't any questions. I'm always happy to talk shop here in person. But I want to thank you all so much for coming out. It means a lot to me that you would spend part of your evening with me talking about these obscure guys. And I hope you enjoyed this and at least piqued your interest in reading a little bit more about some of these forgotten heads of states. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight.